We begin with breaking news in the Paul Manafort trial. On day 4 of deliberations, a jury has sent the judge a note to ask what happens if they can't reach consensus on one of the 18 counts against the president's former campaign chairman. Let's go straight to CBS News Washington correspondent Paula Reid outside a rainy courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. So, Paula, how exactly did the judge handle this, and what did he advise the jurors to do?
Well, this is one of the few questions we've actually gotten from the jury. We last got a question from them last Thursday, but today they came out and they said, look, what happens if there's a single count? They're deciding 18 different counts. What if there's one where we can't agree on? We're not unanimous either way for a conviction or an acquittal. And the judge informed them that, well, that would be a partial verdict if there are some counts that you've agreed on and some that you haven't. But before he would actually accept a partial verdict, he encouraged them to go back into deliberations and try to come to some sort of consensus. And Rita, that is the typical standard operating procedure for any judge when the jury comes and said they haven't been able to make a decision. It is typical that the judge will pretty much every time send them back at least once or twice to keep trying.
And Paul, do you get a sense that this development suggests that we could see a verdict before the end of the day?
It's certainly possible, but they could come back once again and say we still don't have any consensus on one of these counts, and the judge could send them back again. What we don't know, Rena, is which count it is that they may not have reached consensus on, or how many counts they've actually gone through. There are 18 different counts here, 3 completely different types of crime that they'd have to go through. And right now, we really just have no way of knowing how deep in the case there are. So it's possible we could get a verdict, but we really just have no idea what it is that spurred this question. I will say, though, based on my observations throughout this trial, this jury is very methodical, and they tend to save their questions until they've sort of come to a point where they can't get any more work done, and then they come back to the judge. So I do think it's fair to read this as a sign that perhaps they have come to a conclusion on some counts, but are hung up on some others. But it just remains to be seen how long the judge will keep sending them back to try to come up with some sort of firm answer and not a hung jury on that count.
And we know that the count that they're hung up on at this point, we don't know exactly what it is, but as you mentioned, there are 18 different counts. Remind us again, though, of exactly what the jurors have been tasked with trying to determine at this point.
Well, in this case, the special counsel, this is, of course, their first prosecution, they allege that Manafort earned tens of millions of dollars in lobbying work overseas, but instead of having checks delivered to one of his half a dozen homes here in the U.S., they allege that he put all of those earnings into offshore accounts. They then allege that he got the money, laundered it allegedly into the U.S. by loaning himself money or by purchasing luxury goods. And throughout the course of this trial, the jury heard from dozens of witnesses, 27 witnesses in total. They saw dozens and dozens of pieces of evidence. The portions of this case are very well supported. The idea that he did not pay taxes on this money, that's one of the stronger parts of this case. The fact that he allegedly did not disclose that he had 31 allegedly foreign bank accounts, that is also very well supported by evidence and by testimony. But there's another portion of this case. When he allegedly ran out of money, he stopped getting clients in the Ukraine. He had no earnings, and they allege that he started fraudulently applying for loans to help sort of improve his finances. That part of the case, Serena, that's where you get bogged down. There are at least 5 different loans that he applied for. They allege that he lied on portions of those applications. It's complicated, and I think at some point some people could potentially have a reasonable doubt about one of those charges.
You know, you've done a great job laying out sort of the charges against them, but you know, going into this, Paula, this was sort of expected to be a slam dunk by some folks for the prosecution. As it drags on, now what, our 4th day here, is this a bad sign for the prosecution?
So far, based on having been in that courtroom for the past few weeks, I think this all makes sense. If you look at the evidence, if you look at the types of charges, if anyone asked me, I'd say, look, I would expect that perhaps he would be convicted on tax fraud, perhaps on the bank fraud, but on the loan fraud, it is very complicated. And I think his defense attorneys put up enough evidence that someone in the jury room could potentially have a reasonable doubt about some aspects of some loans. We know the jury asked. They wanted a further definition of what it means beyond a reasonable doubt. What is the government's burden? That's why the defense attorney said, we don't even need to put on a case. They didn't even meet their burden. And I think there's a possibility there could be people in that room who agree with that on some of these counts. So far, everything we've seen, it really does seem to make sense, but we don't actually know what's going on in there. But all the tea leaves I'm seeing, it all seems pretty reasonable in the context of the evidence presented.